Hello guys, welcome to another Glory World War II episode podcast. Okay, so now, Chapter 16, Gurkha Assault, the Battle for Mortar Bluff, Bishampur, India, June 26, 1944. Better to die than live a coward. Motto of the Royal Gurkha Rifles. If you are going to make a list of the most face-crushing hardcore military organizations that ever existed, you would have to carve out a spot in the top 3 for the ferocious Gurkha soldiers of the British Army. Recruited from the dirt-poor, dangerous foothills of Nepal's Himalaya mountains, the Gurkhas are a lights-out group of warriors who have served in the British Army with honor and distinction for over 200 years. In their dedicated service to the Queen, these short, humorous, ultra-dangerous killers helped the Crown put down rebellions in India in the 19th century, fearlessly assaulted German machine guns in both world wars, and continue to terrify Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan to this day. Cold, calculating, incredibly brave, and completely brutal in hand-to-hand combat, these guys are famous not only for being some of the most savage warriors on the planet, but also carrying a deadly 18-inch curved knife known as a kukri with them at all times. The kukri is a weird-looking weapon because the blade is on the inside of the curve as opposed to the outside like a samurai sword or cavalry saber. It's said that Gurkhas are trained in a method of attack with this thing that is almost completely unblockable by the enemy. And they love any opportunity to use their kukris in combat. In the early months of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army continued its rampaging expansion across Asia, launching a full-on attack into the British-controlled regions of Burma and Thailand, hoping to destroy the Allied garrison at Imphal in India. The Japanese went after these regions because they wanted to cut off supply routes to the Chinese guerrillas and possibly even open the way for a full-on assault on India itself. They sent those thousands battle-hardened veterans through the trackless Indiana Jones monkey jungle of Southeast Asia, came screaming out of nowhere and attacked British bases at Imphal and Kohima to do this. The brave men of the 17th Black Cat Indian Infantry Division were cut off in Imphal without resupply. But they fought hard, receiving airdrops of everything from bullets to paratroopers to keep struggling against the unrelenting attack. The battle reached a turning point in June 1944 when the Japanese seized a critical position overlooking the only road leading from Imphal to the main British resupply depot at Bishampur. The Allies fought bitterly, but on the night of June 24th, a relentless assault by Japanese troops overran the British defenses and captured the position. As long as they held the high ground overlooking the road, the Japanese could easily drop a mortar on any trucks leading in or out of the besieged city. In fact, the ridge was so good for chucking explosives onto unsuspecting vehicles, it was actually known on maps as Mortar Bluff. It was absolutely vital that the Allies retake this position as quickly as possible so they could bring more men and supplies to the front lines at Imphal. Naturally, they called in the Gurkhas to get the job done. This wouldn't be the first time that a Gan Singh Rai of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, went head-to-head with frontline Japanese troops. He had been part of the unit in 1941 and saw how much of his unit wiped out while facing impossible odds during the Japanese invasion of Burma back in 1942. Now he was eager for revenge. It wasn't going to be easy. Mortar Bluff was at the top of a super steep hill with absolutely no cover behind the Gurkhas and the enemy machine guns and artillery. Worse yet, the bluff backed up against a thick jungle where the Japanese had dug trenches and built bunkers to defend their post, and there was no telling how many guys they had lined up and ready to fight. But when Agansing Rai received orders to take his men in on an attack, he didn't even flinch. On the morning of June 26, the men of 2nd Battalion, 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, came charging out of the dense jungle and began racing up the steep hill toward Mortar Bluff. Japanese machine guns thumped rounds down at them, shredding up the jungle and the hillside with murderous fire. They also brought out a 37mm cannon, a big, scary-looking artillery piece designed specifically to blast enemy infantry to smithereens, and laid into the headstrong Gurkhas with everything they had. Running hard behind their 24-year-old Nake, basically a corporal, the men of Rai's section forced their way 80 yards uphill through intense machine gun and cannon fire, and then finally dove for cover behind a rocky ridge near the top of the cliff. Realizing that many of his men were wounded or dead, and that those who had lived or were going to get chopped to pieces if they hung around too long, Agansing Rai loaded his Thompson machine gun, grabbed a grenade, hopped up, and made a break for the closest Japanese trench. He charged ahead, firing and throwing his grenade, then leapt into the trench and pulled out his Gurkha knife. Agansing Rai killed 3 enemy troops in hand-to-hand combat, cutting and swinging like a madman with his blade. His men, inspired by this display of ferocity, ran ahead, driving into other trenches along Mortar Bluff and wiping out machine gun nests, and took out 3 more enemy soldiers. But this was just the beginning. When the Japanese in the jungle saw Mortar Bluff overrun by Gurkhas, they all turned their machine guns and opened fire on it. This only served to make Agansing Rai even angrier. After grabbing a couple of live grenades and throwing them back at the Japanese, he ordered the last 2 surviving men in his squad to cover him. Then this blood-raging Gurkha went on a one-man assault against a Japanese bunker, running across open field into the jungle, firing his Tommy gun with one hand and lobbing grenades with the other. Rai sprinted to the jungle, jumped into the trench, pulled out his knife, and took out 4 more enemy troops with it, deflecting their rifle swings and laying into them with his blade. The surviving Japanese wisely ran for it. Then Naik Agansing Rai calmly made his way back to Mortar Bluff to regroup with the rest of his unit. It had been bloody, costly, and ultra-violent, but the men of Company C, 2nd Battalion, 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, had captured Mortar Bluff and reopened the only supply and communications route from the main segment of British India to be beside beleaguered, outnumbered Allied forces desperately fighting an infill. Now they had to hold it. Rai's platoon leader was Subadar Netrabahadur Thapa, another tough Gurkha warrior, and he immediately told the 41 surviving men on Mortar Bluff that they weren't out of this just yet. The Japanese had been pushed back, sure, but they were a vicious enemy, and they weren't gonna pack up and walk home just because a couple of Nepalese guys had stuck knives in their eyes. Thapa and his men repositioned machine guns, fortified the trenches, and prepare for a Japanese counterattack. and prepare for Japanese counterattack. It came a few hours later, just around sunset. The Japanese assault began with a bombardment with 37mm and bigger 75mm cannons that rained explosive shells down on the Gurkhas. Then, while their ears were still ringing from the explosions, the Gurkhas saw a full company of over 200 Japanese infantry charging out of the dark jungle toward them. The Gurkhas fought hard with machine guns and rifle fire, laying into the Japanese, but every time the Japanese were pushed back, they simply regrouped and attacked again. It was pitch dark and raining in sheets as wave after wave of determined, heavily armed Japanese infantry poured into the trenches like a tsunami of bayoneted pointiness. The Gurkhas, exhausted from fighting all day long, battled with whatever they had, striking out with knives and rifles in unrelenting battle against an almost endless swarm of troops. By over 4 a.m., over half of Thapa's brave defenders had been wounded, knocked out, or killed, but the rest fought on. With a rallying pump-up speech, Thapa regrouped his Gurkhas, assembled them at the command post, and launched a desperate bayonet attack to nail the swarming Japanese infantry. The brave commander was taken out by a grenade while leading his men, but the Gurkhas slammed into the Japanese Gurkhas first, hammering them with rifles and machine guns at point-blank range. By first light, Agansing Rai was one of the few men left standing atop Mortar Bluff. He was surrounded by the bodies of his allies and enemies alike, but the Gurkhas had held. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, lost close to 800 men in the fighting around Imphal, but thanks in no small part to the heroism, the garrison at Imphal was able to hold off the enemy attack and shatter the Japanese assault force. The Japanese were forced back towards China and would never have the manpower to mount an offensive against the Allies in Asia. Their empire was now beginning to crumble around them on both land and sea.